Okay, cool. Yeah, I can hear you guys. It's pretty faint, but I can definitely hear you guys. It's all good. Okay, great. So I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to MSU Age Alive Town and Gown, a lifelong learning series featuring MSU faculty and community experts. Town and Gown is an MSU Age Alive program in the College of Osteopathic Medicine in partnership with MSU Social Science Scholars Program, Generations Connect, Friends of the East Lansing Seniors Program, East Lansing Primetime Seniors Program, the Great Decisions Program of the Foreign Policy Association, and the People's Church of East Lansing. Thank you for joining us for a special virtual presentation of Town and Gown today. Tonight's presentation is titled The Russo-Ukrainian War, the historian's personal account of life and death in Ukraine, presented by John Vsetecka, Ph.D., Assistant Professor of History, Nova Southeastern University. The presentation will focus on the 1932-33 famine in Ukraine and Russia's current war against Ukraine. The speaker will present virtually for this session. We welcome people on Zoom and our remote site here at the People's Church. Professor Vsetecka is a historian who researches, teaches, and writes about issues concerning famine, the legacies of mass violence, and transitional justice in the Soviet Union and Ukraine. Vsetecka earned his doctorate from the Department of History at Michigan State University in 2023. During the 23-24 academic year, Vsetecka was the Jaroslaw and Nadia postdoctoral scholar in Ukrainian studies at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. At this time, please join us in welcoming Professor Vsetecka.
Thank you, Kenny, for that very nice introduction. And I know I have a very difficult last name and a lot of Ukrainian terms behind some of my titles. So that was really good, Kenny. I really appreciate that.
I
I'm going to,
apologize.
no, it was wonderful. It was great. And thank you for having me here. I'm sorry that I couldn't be in East Lansing in person. I spent 6 years of my life in Lansing, East Lansing, earning my doctorate as an MSU now alum before going to Boston. And now I am in sunny Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where it is an atrocious 85 degrees and very hot, maybe much different from that of Michigan. So I'm going to screen share my presentation for today. I'm hopeful that you'll be able to see it. Please let me know if you cannot. Does that seem to work for everybody? Can you see it fine? Perfect. Okay. So I am going to talk a little bit today. I've altered the talk for sort of, clarity and time. And assuming that you don't know much about Ukraine, actually, I originally was going to talk a little bit more about some of the research that I do on the history of famine, and I will talk a little bit about this today, but I'm going to keep it more about current events and the Russo-Ukrainian War that is continually ongoing, even in this moment. So the title of the talk, as Kenny graciously sort of introduced me, is the Russo-Ukrainian War. Me as a historian and my personal account of life and death in Ukraine. And out of sensitivity too, I've really tried to include, just images that are not too provocative for general, viewership. So there's really nothing in here that I think you'll have to look away for too much. But if there's something, I'll be sure to let you know. So again, I want to thank you for all the organizations that made this possible and are having me here today. And so I'll try to talk for maybe the next 30 minutes or so, and then be happy to, answer any questions that you have about things related to this talk, about history, about things that are going on now, even today, with peace negotiations, or so they're called, between Russia and the United States. And Ukraine is not currently at those negotiations, and we can talk about that a little bit more. So let me give you just a little bit of background to my story as it relates to Ukraine. When I was teaching at Michigan State University between 2017 and 2023, there was a point when I would teach world and European history classes, and many of my students wouldn't know where Ukraine was on a map. I would give sort of map exercises in which I'd ask them to sort of label as many countries as possible. And after sort of, Germany, it gets a little iffy in Central Europe. And by the time they get to Eastern Europe, maybe they know Russia, but certainly maybe not Belarus. or the Caucasus, or Central Asia, places like Kazakhstan and Mongolia, and these types of places. So I start with just giving you a sense of where we're talking about in Europe for those who maybe don't know, or who haven't visited a map in a while, to sort of look at the sort of territory that Ukraine occupies in Europe. It's a very large country, as you can see. It straddles the border with Russia. This has played a provocative role in the war that's happened not just since 2022, but before, and I'll talk about that. But as you can gauge by the sort of size of the country just on this image alone, it's quite big, and it takes up a number of kilometers in Europe, and is a sizable country that contributes not only politically to Europe, but also agriculturally, and has a number of exports, such as sunflower oil. Is like one of the fifth largest exporters in the world, that have been affected by this war. So it plays a pivotal role as a sort of gateway between Russia and Central Asia, and that of what people have sort of deemed Europe proper. Now, to give you another sense of how big Ukraine is, this map is overlaid on territories of the United States. So if you were to sort of, superimpose this map on the US like it is here, you have very far western city like Lviv. Maybe you've heard of this place. That's in, pretty much the westernmost region of Ukraine, which would fall somewhere around Chicago. And it would extend eastward, all the way to where the city of Kharkiv is, which is a very important city during this war right now, a sort of eastern lying territory, eastern lying Ukrainian city, constantly bombarded, that is all the way over on the east coast. So although Ukraine maybe doesn't look quite as big as the United States, it's for Europe, and for the perspective of size, it's quite huge. And I can't emphasize this enough. It's a very large territory, right? When I travel between these cities, and I'll share some pictures of my recent trip to Ukraine just a few months ago. I continue to go even during the war and do a number of things, and I'll talk about this. They have a really amazing train system that runs between this huge country, and it's very effective to get to places quite easily on these sophisticated trains. So it is a big country, but quite easy to navigate, and they have one of the best train systems actually in all of Europe. It's very effective, and even during the war, they're known for running on time almost every single train. It's simply amazing, and it allows people to travel when necessary. Now, to give you just some basic facts about this, and I'm not going to give you necessarily just a historical lecture. I actually just finished giving my lectures for the day. I teach here at Nova Southeastern, and was talking about some of this in my world history class today. And this is, the week that is about to mark the 3-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that hit on February 24th, 2022. So next Monday marks the 3-year anniversary of that, a very somber occasion. So I give you a few basic facts about Ukraine, and then I want to sort of give you maybe my personal, directive of how I became sort of associated with Ukraine, and how I found myself there during the war and what happened. And I'll give you sort of a history through what I experienced, and share some personal stories about that I think you'll find interesting. So not counting Russia in this, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe, as I sort of talked about. It depends on how you conceptualize these things. What is Europe? What is not? But properly in Europe, Ukraine is the largest country. It gained its actually second round of independence in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. Although sort of a little known fact for people who maybe are not familiar with Ukraine is that it was actually independent for a brief period of time from 1918 to the early 1920s before the Soviet Union formed. And so it had a period of independence following what is commonly known as the Russian Revolution of 1917. There was also a Ukrainian revolution that took place at the same time. So it's not just a Russian thing, and it's about how we sort of articulate these histories. And during that period, Ukraine had independence, and their state languages were actually in 4 languages. The documents related to that, and then they were absorbed into the Soviet Union, and became part of this sort of Soviet experiment, as historians called it, from the early 1920s up until the fall of it in 1990 and 1991. Currently, the population in Ukraine is about 44 million people. This is obviously changing with the amount of people who are being killed in the war, which is an increasing amount of not just military personnel, but also civilians. So one thing to know about this war is that it heavily targets civilians every day. In fact, just before I sat down to talk with you all, I have this application on my phone that when you travel to Ukraine, you have to have it on there. It's an air raid alert. And they ding every time there's air raid sirens that go off, and it alerts me because I still have it on my phone because I still travel there. And it's a reminder that, we sit comfortably on Zoom and have a talk about Ukraine, and people are hiding in the bomb shelters right now, literally right now, as Shahed drones are flying over places like the capital of Kyiv and, trying to destroy civilian infrastructure and the military and all these things. So it is quite a large population. This is shifting, of course, people in and out of Ukraine. Some have fled the country, those who can. Some of them have left. Others have stayed. Men between the conscription ages of the military, they cannot leave due to military assignments. So women mostly and children are the ones that have left the country. They sort of are in and out of other countries of Europe. So this number fluctuates a lot right now. And the official language, of course, in Ukraine is Ukrainian. This is a more complicated history in which, Russian is commonly spoken across Ukraine as well. Different parts of Ukraine prefer different languages, Ukrainian or Russian, but since the full-scale invasion, there's been a massive turn in people primarily speaking Ukrainian, even if they didn't know it before. They've started to learn it. It's a way for them to further distance themselves from the Russian imperial past, to distance themselves linguistically from the people that are committing what experts now call a genocidal war against them. So Ukrainian has been around for a long time. It's a beautiful language. I started studying Ukrainian a long time ago and went to Ukraine and studied with Ukrainian instructors. And it's a very beautiful language. And an interesting fact about it is a lot of people, I even have students that say, well, they're basically the same language, right? Not at all. There are similarities, of course, and there are a lot of other differences. For those of you who are really linguistically inclined, you can look this up. But the next closest language to Ukrainian is not Russian. It's actually Belarusian. It has a much more common linguistic history with that, and even Polish than say Russian. So these basic facts give you sort of an idea of what Ukraine is and what it's about. Now, something else too, particularly maybe those of you who grew up knowing something about the Soviet Union or even during its existence, Ukraine was often sort of misidentified as the Ukraine. And in fact, this sort of thinking and vernacular exists. It exists today, but with the outbreak of the full-scale invasion in 2022, reporters and prominent outlets like the New York Times and others continue to write the Ukraine, and people today of different generations still sort of use this term, but it's problematic. And so something to know is like, the article "the" is really sort of an imperial and colonial hangover from not just Soviet times, but also the Russian imperial period and before, that references Ukraine as part of Russia, as part of the Russian imperial empire, as part of the Soviet Union, and not as an independent country, not as a sovereign territory that makes its own political decisions, has its own language, has its own laws, its own people, religions, customs, etc. So this distinction is crucial, and it's important to get it right. This is something that people still get corrected on, and it's not the Ukraine; it's just Ukraine. And to articulate it without the demonstrates knowledge that we understand and recognize Ukraine as a sovereign nation and territory in this way. So just something else that's important to know. Now, to give you a little context of the war in Ukraine, and sadly, I hate to even talk about Ukraine just in terms of war because there's so much more to the country than just war and violence. Now, for someone like me who studies famines and genocides and legacies of mass violence, I talk about these things all the time. I read documents in different languages from the past about this all the time. And now, as sort of an expert on Ukraine, I'm asked to talk about war all the time. And so I will talk about it today because it's important and this is ongoing. But I will also sort of challenge us to think about Ukraine also as a place, just like the United States, that has good things going on. They have food, they have culture, they go to movies, people go on dates, they're in love. They do all these things even during the war. This isn't just a war-torn place. And this sort of the idea of part of this Russian war against Ukraine is to make it seem like it's not a place at all that doesn't exist, but it very much exists. And they're people just like us. So if we really want to think critically about how this war came to be, we actually need to go back further in time than 2022. We need to go back to the fall of 2013. And this is when a major sort of revolution, it's called the Revolution of Dignity, or what was known as Euromaidan, maybe you've heard these terms, in which the Ukrainian people, I'll give you a very short way of thinking about this, basically come to the streets to oust then president and leader of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who had rejected a proposal that would align Ukraine with the EU. And instead, he chose to sort of align himself with Putin and Russia. And there's more to the story, of course. But what happened is a mass turnout, millions and millions of Ukrainians across the country to protest this decision, to protest against aligning themselves with Russia. They saw this as sort of orbiting back into the Soviet sphere of influence, and they didn't want to do this. They wanted to, be more aligned with the West. They wanted to progress. They wanted to make changes to their law, to their economy, eventually maybe join NATO, these kinds of things. And they ended up protesting in the streets and ousting Viktor Yanukovych, who fled and is in Russia to this day, I think. His whereabouts are, I think, unknown, but he fled to Russia. And so what we need to understand about all of this is not the gritty details of what happened right in 2013 or 2014, but the events that followed this revolution. So it starts in the fall of 2013 and sort of culminates in 2014. This is a moment in which Putin does not like that Ukraine resists the Russian agenda. And it is in 2014 that he occupies Crimea illegally. This is sovereign Ukrainian territory, home historically to the Crimean Tatar population and others, and also starts his war against Ukraine in the eastern territories, or what you may have heard in the news labeled as Donbass, which is made up of two oblasts, or two territories known as Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast. So the full-scale invasion that happened in Russia, or by Russia, in February of 2022, this didn't mark the start of a war, actually. Those of us paying attention and who know our history well, this war started in 2014, and a lot of people say it even started earlier because there's a much longer historical context to this, but this is for another day. So what happened when the bombs started falling on February 24th, 2022, was a massive uptick in violence that would forever alter the geography and scope of this war in new ways. So this is an image from the Euromaidan protests. This is a famous statue that is in the capital in Kyiv. Maybe some of you have traveled to Ukraine, I don't know. I assume many people have not. And this is where hundreds of thousands of people gathered at the central square. It's called Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square, this main sort of center of gathering, in which people protested, and they put up these barriers with tires, and they ended up having to get into physical violence with these sort of state police who were actually firing live bullets on them at one place. And as a result of this, it was very violent. Some people did die during this revolution, this protest. It actually started with a group of university students, as a lot of protests do. There's a famous sort of figure. His name is Mustafa Nayyem. He actually works in the Ukrainian government right now, who wanted to, align Ukraine with this sort of EU agenda, and called on his fellow students to come join him in a protest on the Maidan. And he posted on Facebook, "Likes don't count." And that's the famous phrase that comes from this revolution: likes don't count. And what he meant is, don't just like my post, actually join me in solidarity out on this Independence Square, and let's protest what's happening to our country. Well, soon enough, the students were, intimidated by state police and harassed. And that is when the rest of the country sort of showed up to defend these students. And it turned into, millions strong protest against Russia in defense of Ukraine, and new presidential elections were held after the oust of Viktor Yanukovych. To this day, Vladimir Putin does not recognize Volodymyr Zelensky as president, because he says that this ouster of Yanukovych in 2013, 2014 was illegal, and therefore he's still the right president of Ukraine. This is what Putin thinks. Obviously, it's not true. So after the revolution of dignity, this is when things really escalate with this war in Ukraine. So in response to this revolution, President Putin takes a sort of strongman approach and actually deploys Russian soldiers into these territories that I told you about. And you can see them on the screen here. Luhansk and Donetsk, this is the Donbass area. It borders Russia. And it's a very interesting place with a very unique history, lots of coal mining and industrial projects that took place in there. It's actually a very, interesting international place. There's a town there named after John Hughes, the industrialist, called Husovka. And it's where people from all over the world came at one point to be sort of involved in industrial projects related to Ukraine and Russia. So it's a really international place in a way. They have a famous soccer team, and in fact, actually, in the 2000s, even Beyonce went to this region and performed a concert at one of the new soccer stadiums. So it does have an international reputation. It's not just some place, that doesn't matter. Well, what happens in this moment then in 2014 is that Putin sends pro-Russian militants. They're called Little Green Men. They're not wearing Russian insignia. It's supposed to sort of signal to us that this isn't Russia that's sending people in, but other factions that don't agree with what Ukraine is doing. But of course, they're soldiers from Russia with different uniforms, and they come in and they occupy these territories of Luhansk and Donetsk, and say, we're going to come here and liberate the people of Ukraine because the Ukrainians are, not letting them speak Russian, which is not true, says that they're oppressing these people and that they need to be liberated. And this is the sort of phony justification that Putin uses to save, right, in quotes, the people of Eastern Ukraine. So he uses this sort of as a proxy to put Russian troops on the ground, occupy these territories, and start a war against Ukraine, who at this point was not militarily ready to handle any kind of major escalation. And this would, of course, be problematic later, but we'll talk about that in a minute. They also then, the Russians, occupy down here this part of Crimea. So you'll notice if you go back to, I can show you later, the slide of Ukraine that I showed you, any real map that actually knows Ukrainian history knows that Crimea is part of Ukraine. It's home of, like I said, to the Crimean Tatars. And Putin annexes Crimea illegally at this point too, and develops a land bridge that goes from the Russian territories over here next to Crimea into Crimea. And it's a way for them to control military operations and bring people in to Ukraine to start this war that would really begin in 2014. Okay, so the point is just to know that this war has a much longer history than maybe 2022. And it's good to know these sort of historical facts to get a sense of why these things are happening. Well, now I'll give you a little bit of my personal perspective. Enter me. And I'm sorry to have my face, blasting on you at the screen, but I wanted to share some pictures of what life was like. Well, when I was at Michigan State University, I was applying for funding to go to Ukraine to do my dissertation research on a famine that took place in the 1930s. It's now known as the Holodomor, which in Ukrainian means death or murder by starvation. It was a famine that took place, is a man-made famine, as all modern famines are, in which the Soviet Union intentionally starves 3.5 to 5 million Ukrainians between 1932 and 1933, as in part to fund the industrial building of the Soviet Union. Ukraine was rich in agriculture. They produced wheat. They were known as the breadbasket of Europe, the granary of Europe. And Stalin takes this grain from the Ukrainian peasants at the time to sell to industrial markets to develop the Soviet Union. And what results is this famine. So I went to Ukraine to study this famine, to go to the archives, to do research for my dissertation that I would eventually finish in East Lansing, so close to where all of you are sitting today. I was lucky enough to get this award called a Fulbright, which is a sort of prestigious grant that allows researchers like myself to go spend a year abroad working on our research and to integrate into the community and practice our language skills and deliver lectures and things like this. So due to COVID, I was actually meant to go during 2020, but because of COVID, you'll remember this, it slowed everything down. And then in 2021, I was finally allowed to go. Now, to give you some context, already in June of 2021, and even a little bit earlier, there was all this news about Russian troops starting to build up on the border of Ukraine. So I was watching this carefully because the war has been going on since 2014. Russians were in Ukraine waging war. And I was aware of this. I had traveled to Ukraine many times before this. I grew up going to a place that I know, a country that I love, that's always been waged in war. I didn't become, sort of a professional historian of Ukraine until about 2012. And then shortly thereafter, the Russians occupied it. So I've, spent my entire professional working life going to a country that's at war in some capacity. But nonetheless, I got over there in the fall and I spent the semester working in archives and taking beautiful pictures. This one in the center is on a beautiful fall day, very beautiful fall that year on my walk home. It's next to a nice museum. I lived in this very trendy neighborhood called Podil, which is next to the river. And there's a lot of art exhibitions and museums and cafes and a very like cool intellectual life going on there. Very beautiful buildings. This is me in in front of one of the cathedrals with these golden domes, just absolutely beautiful. And I was doing things too. I was giving lectures at universities in Ukraine. This picture on the right that you can see is with one of my Ukrainian colleagues who is a professor, and I got to go speak to her class in one of the lecture halls on sort of what it means to do the kind of work that I do. So the point being is that it was a very beautiful time to be in Ukraine. Life was going on more or less normally, despite COVID raging. I was doing my research, I was hanging out with my friends, and enjoying a really nice time. So, despite this war still going on, already in 2021 because of events in 2014, life was more or less normal. That would change, of course. Well, I didn't get to spend a full year in Ukraine. There was talk about the increasing amount of Russian troops that were coming into Ukraine all fall. I was in touch with the embassy because this Fulbright grant that I was on is part of the Department of State. So I was on government orders. I was in contact with all the right people in the government. I had, access to information that was a privilege to know because it helped sort of get me out of danger a couple of times. And I got a notification. I was worried that I flew home to Michigan for Christmas to see my wife. I hadn't seen her, in about 6 months at that point. And so she was unable to join me. She was supposed to come over in the spring, but obviously plans got changed because of the war. And so I went home and came back thinking that, like, okay, I'm aware that this war could expand, but so far things seem more or less the same. So I came back from Christmas and was there for, just under 2 months. Well, I guess just about a month. And I got orders from the Department of State that I had 3 days to pack my belongings, get out of my apartment, get my affairs in order, and I had to get out of the country. Now, this was a little bit unnerving because at the time the embassy was saying that nothing was happening. On the other hand, if you were following their Twitter feed and their social media feeds at the time, all you saw were American planes coming in with artillery shells and ammunition and military supplies, which indicated to me that they were stocking Ukraine up for what would eventually come out to be a full-scale war. So there's competing messages. But in my personal life, I was very stressed because I was a grad student. I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do for my research now that I'm getting evacuated out of Ukraine. I had to pack up my apartment and break my lease and these kinds of things. Two of my good friends in the city, in the capital of Kiev, just had their baby, and she's pictured here in the middle. Her name is Sophia. She was born on January 20th. The hospital that she was born at has actually been shelled. I just visited it when I was there this summer because the last time I was there was to see her. I couldn't go into the hospital because of COVID, so I had to, sort of wave at her from outside on the street next to this beautiful park. And she was born, so I had to leave my friends, and this was very tough. And one of them is American, the other is Ukrainian, and so they were, just had a baby, and they're trying to figure out how to, it's very taxing to have a child, as some of you know, and you can't just pick up your life and move right after a birth. So they were very stressed, and I was very worried about them. And for myself, trying to figure out everything that was going on. This was a time when you still had to get a negative COVID test to cross borders. Some of you may remember that if you were traveling. And I was very nervous because COVID was raging. Very few people were vaccinated in Ukraine. Like only 3% of people at the time were vaccinated. And I, was masking and doing all of these things, but I still had to get a COVID test to actually leave Ukraine to go to Poland, which is where the Department of State sent us. And luckily, my COVID test came back negative, and I was allowed to board a plane on January 26th, 2022, and leave. So I left just about 3 weeks before the bombing would happen. Well, I was sent to Warsaw. The idea was that if the war didn't actually happen, that maybe we would be able to go back. But I had intelligence and understanding from a few different sources that this was never going to be the case. So I stayed in Poland for a little while to figure out what would happen. I was still being funded by Fulbright. I had the option at some point to go home and just go back to the US and be done with my Fulbright. And I decided I wouldn't go home, despite not being with my own family, despite the danger that I faced both in Ukraine and in Poland. And I decided that this war probably is going to happen and there's something I can do to help. So if you look at these pictures here, this is from my time when I lived in Warsaw. The picture at the top, that's sort of dark gray with the cathedral, the golden domes, and the smoke. That's the neighborhood where I lived in Podil. The day that Russia started the full-scale invasion on February 24th, my neighborhood was bombed where I was living. So I was lucky to not be there anymore. My building that I lived in wasn't hit, but it was close enough. Um, I stayed with colleagues and others as these bombs started to fall across Ukraine. You may have remembered the news at this point that it was the largest sort of movement and refugee crisis in European history since World War II. People were leaving in mass to come to Poland to get to safety, to get into the EU. I spent that day, I was up all night talking to friends when the bombing started across Ukraine. I remember that horrific night. I didn't sleep. And I joined, tens of thousands of protesters on February 24th at the Russian embassy in Warsaw to protest the war. And this is where all these were. There were Russian agents and operatives as part of this protest trying to disperse it. Because my name was on a specific list associated with the American government, I was followed home. I was stalked. I was intimidated and interrogated by people associated with Russia. This is how their operations work. We now know that these people have even followed professors into their classrooms across the country. Some sit in their classes and pretend to be from other countries. There's a great book about this that just happened to a colleague of mine called Intent to Destroy, in which a Russian agent pretended to be from Brazil and took his classes at Johns Hopkins University at the Florence or the Bologna campus in Italy, and was getting information on professors who had studied Ukraine to give intelligence back to the Kremlin. So we were targets, but luckily I was able to, avoid serious injury. To give you a sense of all that happening, I also got my bank accounts hacked by Russian hackers. They also targeted my family. So these things all to say that being, a historian of a place that just a few weeks earlier, very few people could even point out on a map or even care about, all of a sudden, you become a persona non grata. And remember, I'm just a lowly grad student at Michigan State at the time, trying to write a dissertation and get a job as a professor. And so my life escalated quite quickly, along with that of the events in Ukraine. Now, you'll be happy to know that the sort of friends that I told you about that had the baby through a set of a horrific 2 weeks of journey across Ukraine with a newborn, which is out. I'm a new father myself, so I can't imagine bringing my child like this across a war-torn country. They did get to safety in Warsaw. I had a small apartment there. We lived together, and actually more friends and Ukrainian refugees joined us. I think like at one time there was 5 or 6 of us in one bedroom. People were sleeping in bathtubs. I was doing a lot of media at the time, like in the bathroom, like literally sitting, like there was no other place to sit, but like on top of the toilet and do these interviews talking about the war as I was staying and helping refugees get across the border in Poland. I was picking them up at the border, going into Ukraine to help people, getting them food, helping them find places to stay, money, jobs, hygiene products, all the basic things that you don't have when you flee a country that is getting bombed. So it was really fortunate that my friends James and Anya and their baby Sophie, they got out of Ukraine. It was hell though. This picture in the middle of them is in a bomb shelter in a closet in a home of some people who took them in one night, feeding their child, just a bottle. And along the way, they met some really nice people and were able to stay with actually this picture on the far right with the child and this other woman. One of those people is my Ukrainian teacher that I studied Ukrainian with in Lviv, and they took my friend James and Anya in, and that's where I met them, was studying Ukrainian. And so our network of friends helped them get out of Ukraine, and they came to live with me in Warsaw for a while after that. And together, we just continued to help Ukrainians get out of the war zone and adjust to life outside of their home country. Well, I stayed in Poland for a while, and then I had to make a choice about visa extensions. And I also hadn't seen my own wife for a while, and she wanted me to come home, rightfully so. I hesitated to come home. I felt very guilty about it. It was a privilege to be able to get on a Lufthansa flight and just come back to Detroit, a direct flight. And it was very hard for me. But I remember that flight only because that's the first time I think I slept all 10 or 11 hours of that flight. I slept the whole time because I probably hadn't slept in months in any real way. And I also remember landing at Detroit International Airport, and they, checked my passport coming back in, welcoming me back to the United States. And the lady at the booth checking my passport saw my Ukrainian visa, and she goes, "Ukraine, isn't there something happening there?" That's what she said to me. Hadn't followed the news, didn't really know. And it just devastated me to realize that I was coming back to a society that people maybe weren't even caring about, and I was just in a war zone and helping people come from a war zone. Well, I did what I could when I got back. You'll recognize these pictures. This, of course, is downtown Lansing at the Capitol. And the Michigan State community, as well as the other, just the regular community, was involved in supporting Ukraine. There was a lot of support. I was there. This is a picture of me and my Fulbright stuff. And this very sign that I'm holding was the one that I held at the Russian embassy, that got me sort of interrogated by Russian special forces and spies. They didn't like that I had this. The picture in the middle, of course, is somebody else you might know from the Michigan State community, and that's Dr. Matt Pauley, who was my advisor and guided my dissertation and my research, but also is just a wonderful human being to me during this whole process, speaking in solidarity. He is a historian of Ukraine. If you need to know anything about Ukraine, he is, accessible to you in the East Lansing community. He is the expert at MSU, and I'm grateful for everything he's done for me. So I came back home and continued to do what I could from East Lansing. I did a number of events in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. I traveled a lot. I used all my free time to advocate for Ukraine. I became part of an organization that was doing humanitarian work. My mom even got involved. We did things like supply war-torn areas with clean water. And basically what we did is we bought out outdoor companies like REI and Backdoor Outdoor Country, bought all their water filters that people use for camping and shipped them to the eastern part of Ukraine so people could have clean water. So I came home and the war didn't leave me. It followed me home and I continued to do what I did. We also housed, even though I was still a grad student and I was trying to finish a dissertation, we had 3 Ukrainian refugees live with us during the fall semester of 2022 when I got home as I came back to teaching. So the war came to Michigan, and there's a lot of people from Ukraine that are still there to this day. Which brings me up, and I'll wrap up in the next couple of minutes and be happy to take some questions about any of this. After I got home, things continued to deteriorate in Ukraine, and they're still deteriorating. One of these now, of course, is the threat to nuclear stability and security. There's Russia continues to strike these nuclear power plants that will really devastate Europe and Russia itself, among other places, should they be compromised. One of these is the Zaporizhian power plant, which is in southeastern Ukraine. And there's actually a number of nuclear power plants in Ukraine. These are shelled often. And this week, actually, you may have read about it in the news. Russians hit the dome that covers the Chernobyl exclusion, or the Chernobyl nuclear plant, excuse me. And of course, you remember 1986 in April when the Chernobyl nuclear disaster happened. A major event in not just Ukrainian history, but world history. They had to cover that with the special sort of barrier that keeps the contaminants inside in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And the Russians bombed that this week and compromised the integrity of that. So it shows that they're still sort of, going after these major facilities in Europe that obviously could lead to a huge nuclear catastrophe should this continue to happen. Now, this is where I will go back just for a sec. The next photo is maybe the only one that is really difficult to look at, and it's of mass graves from the war. I visited some of these. I visited mass graves a number of times from the 1930s in the famine, in which people were just dug, or pits were dug, and people were just thrown into what they called fraternal graves by the Soviets. Very hard places to visit. And this is what's happening now. So I'll give you a chance, if you don't want to, look at this picture of the mass grave, now's your chance to look away. This is the reality of the war. We have satellite imagery that is now giving us a sense of the scale. If you go on Google, Google Earth and look at satellite imagery of Ukraine, you'll notice that lots of cemeteries and areas next to cemeteries that weren't actually designated for burial grounds have become burial grounds because there's so many people dying. One of the more horrific things is when the Russians entered Ukraine during the first phase of the full-scale invasion. They tried to go after places like Kyiv and Kharkiv and other places. And what they did is they went in and murdered civilians in all these towns. You heard about maybe places like Bucha or Irpin or Mariupol, the siege of the plant there. And what they did is they tied civilians' hands behind their backs. They raped women and children and men, and then would shoot them in the back of the head and dump them in these graves. So there's a lot of exhumations taking place to try and figure out how many people are buried in these, trying to give them a dignified burial, try to adhere to Ukrainian last rites and customs and traditions and this kind of thing. You're still finding new graves almost daily. Some of them are just marked with little sticks with numbers because they have to get to them when they can. Resources are low, and there's tens of thousands of civilian casualties to date, and it's just horrific. And I fear that whenever this war does end, and we actually have to start accounting for every single person, every single civilian that was killed, we're going to find even more in terms of horrific numbers. And these graves tell a dark story. This is what people are dealing with in Ukraine. So I'll sort of wrap up here and one more slide and just give you a sense of my last trip to Ukraine. Despite my family's wishes and a lot of other people's wishes, I continue to travel to the war-torn country. I continue to work there. I continue to do work with my Ukrainian colleagues. I'm teaching summer school in the capital this summer. I was there this previous summer when the Children's Cancer Hospital was hit in July in this capital of Kyiv. I was just a few blocks away living from that when it's the equivalent of like the Mayo Clinic in Ukraine, if you can believe that. Just families getting treatment for children's cancer, and a missile hit it and killed a lot of people. And there's no power when you go there. Everything's run on generators now, and this is in the capital too. So I don't. You only have a little bit of electricity. You have to charge your phones at night and hope that they keep a charge so you have battery the next day. You don't have lights. I showered in the dark a lot. Sometimes didn't have hot water. It's just a really hard place to exist right now. And this is because the energy grids are continually targeted by Russia. But I did go out and visit some of these towns that were occupied by Russia. These two pictures on the left, the top one, you can see this concrete sort of building with this sort of tan thing. It says Lude in Ukrainian. It means people. Basically, it was people, innocent Ukrainian civilians were hiding in there, and they wrote Lude on there, hoping that the Russians who came into Kyiv would leave them alone. They were hoping that they would attack the military but leave the people alone. But you'll notice all the bullet holes on this infrastructure. So it actually didn't serve them properly, and in fact, the Russians just fired bullets at these people and killed them. And the second picture is of a destroyed house hit by Russian artillery. And these two pictures are both in the town of Bucha, which you may have heard a lot about in the news, a place that suffered horrendously. So this is my visit to Bucha this summer. And then, of course, this picture on the right is of Maidan Nezalezhnosti, which is this independence square in the heart of Ukraine. And each one of these flags represents someone that's been killed in this war. There's other pictures of destroyed military equipment that are now littered throughout the streets to remind people of what they're facing. Life is tough, but the Ukrainians are very resilient, and they continue to do the best with the minimal resources that they have at this moment in time. So to give you a conclusion of sort of where we are now, we're in a dark phase. This is a protracted war at this point. It has spanned years, but it could continue to go on. We know as of right now, the U.S. and Russia are allegedly in discussion about peace talks, but Ukraine has not been invited to these. And of course, rightfully so, Ukraine will not recognize peace talks that don't include them. This was Russia's war of aggression, and this could just be over if Russia leaves, but we know that won't happen. So we're not sure what these peace talks might bring. The displacement of Ukrainians and families are in your communities in East Lansing. And I'm disappointed that I couldn't be there in person because I would like to visit a lot of my friends who still live in East Lansing and Ann Arbor and Kalamazoo and in Warren, Michigan, where the big Ukrainian population is, of course. There's lots of people right next door to you. So if you encounter any of them, talk to them, support them, show a little support. They were very grateful when they came to Michigan and saw all the Ukrainian flags flying at the start of this war. And those don't exist anymore. So, they sort of feel forgotten in these ways. But little acts of care and solidarity go a long way. And what's going to happen now, I don't know. I'm a historian, not a predictor of the future. Russia is suffering brutal losses as well as Ukraine. We don't know how this war will end, but all I can tell you right now is that things continue to be really awful. And each day more and more people continue to die from this war. But the Ukrainians have given us a lesson in resilience, a lesson to standing up to an army that people thought would just crush them in a matter of days, and that hasn't happened. And they're giving us a lot of hope for what could be a very dark future. So I will stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions and answer any queries that you have. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was very powerful.
Thank you. Yeah, Jane, you have your hand up.
Yes. I'm also a historian, and my area of interest is Anglo-American relations from 38 to 40. Um, it is common in the press today to see what is happening this very day, this very week, as another Munich. Would you care to expand on that?
Um, yeah, it's thanks, Jane. Nice to talk to another historian. It's it has been articulated as another Munich, as another betrayal, as a giving of land um, to those in power. I think there are historical parallels to this, absolutely. Russia continues to give us more and more reason to believe that this very well, could repeat. Although as historians, of course, we don't say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
Right?
There are different contexts to this. Um, what has gone from deliberate American support, although without, we can criticize this under Biden as well. There was at least support for this, and at least an articulation that Ukraine was not going to be sold out. But this has completely changed under the new administration, which we were all wary of. And it absolutely looks like
Yeah.
Ukraine could be sold out from underneath itself without its opportunity to speak. Now, if you know anything about the Ukrainians, we can continue to talk about them without their input, but they will never accept that. Last time this happened to them, they took to the streets and pushed those people out. So I think that Russia and the U.S. can have these conversations, but they are really underestimating what Ukraine can do if decisions are made without them. Now, I'm hopeful that these negotiations that are happening now, right? We can't take everything in the media at face value, even from good reporting. Is that my guess is that the U.S. is using this as a litmus test to gauge how willing Putin is to maybe talk about some form of settlement. They're trying to maybe fill him out. And it may not be that they're going to purposely exclude Ukraine, but they want to get a sense of their relations before this happens. The other opportunity, too, is what I'm wary of actually is not another Munich, but another 19th century scramble. Not a scramble for Africa this time, but a scramble for Ukraine is what I am calling it. The reason for this is that Trump had offered to buy, they wanted access to rare earth materials in Ukraine in
Yeah.
exchange for weapons. But if you read the agreement, it wasn't actually for new weapons, it was for payment for old weapons that we had already given them. So what I worry about is Russia and the U.S. starting to divvy up for resources Ukraine and forcing Ukraine's hand in this way. So it could be something like Munich. It might be something worse.
Thank you. I enjoyed your lecture very much, and I love the Ukrainians and their fighting spirit.
Thank you, Jane. It means a lot to them
Sure,
for sure.
sure.
Um, it looks like there's a question from John. What do you see as the best case scenario for Ukraine, given the current U.S. position and the resources and men and material at Russia's disposal? I mean, that's a tough one, John. I don't have an answer of what I don't know what the best case scenario is for Ukraine because that's going to be up to them to decide what the best case scenario for them is. Um, I think the best case scenario, of course, is Russia just walks away with U.S. pressure and doesn't get humiliated economically any further. I think right now the best case scenario is that, and Zelensky's articulated that it's not going to be ideal, but they may have to give up some of these occupied territories in the east and have a protracted settlement for now. And then Zelensky has said that they'll have to approach getting that back diplomatically. And what that signals to me is he wants this war and the soldiers want this war to end. They don't want to keep sending people to die. They don't have infinite amounts of people, but neither does Russia, although they're recruiting the North Koreans and stuff like this.
Mhm.
So I think the best outcome now is that they may have to settle for some sort of territorial loss at the moment, but it's going to be not permanent. It'll be sort of temporary. For how long, we don't know. The reason that this is a problem and the reason that they keep rejecting this idea instead of just calling it a day there is that any sort of territory that then is occupied by Russia is only going to turn into another conflict later. And this is what studying Ukrainian history tells us. Over and over and over again, the Russians have continued to occupy parts of Ukraine. So if you give them this, you signal to a supposed strongman like Putin that it's okay. What happens though is Putin doesn't live forever, but a successor of him will see that, look, if you just hang on long enough, they'll give up territory, and that starts to creep, and that's really a dangerous precedent. And so I think what happens for now is that may be the best case scenario. They're trying to figure out a way to protect civilians. You know, if you remember back to 2022, they were asking for things like the Iron Dome that Israel had to protect the civilians. They need more air missile defense. They now have one of probably the best capable militaries in the world. So other militaries will have to study, you know, this new form of warfare and drones, and the U.S. is learning a lot. And so I think for now, John, that's the best case scenario. Is again, I'm not saying I'm advocating for it or even think that is what will happen, but there might be some talks for this. Russia wants the economic sanctions dropped by the U.S. They want to do business as usual, but so does the U.S. We have something to gain from that. And for now, I see that as sort of the best outcome that is reasonably expected to happen. But of course, you know, things could take a turn. Things seem to happen very quickly these days under new administration. So I'm not exactly sure what will take place. Thank you. Happy to ask, to talk to anybody else too, that, you know, even if you don't have a question about the history or just a question about Ukraine or the people, or you know, I encourage you too, since you are in Michigan, they do a number of events at Michigan State University. In fact, there's an upcoming one with a colleague of mine, a Ukrainian colleague, who's bringing an art exhibition to MSU. And there's going to be some Ukrainian events associated with that. I don't know the details or the dates, but I think it's public information. So you can go to these lectures. We have a Center for Russian East European Studies that is headed by the wonderful Vlad Tarabara, who is actually from Ukraine himself, from Dnipro city in southeastern Ukraine. And you also have Warren, Michigan, which is home to a long-living Ukrainian diaspora, one of the largest in the U.S. And they do lots of events down near Detroit. They also just hired a few people to work at the University of Michigan who work on Ukraine. So there's a lot of good Ukrainian things going on in Michigan, should you be interested in these things. Oh, okay. So we have another question from Babs Kraus here. Do you think that Russia intends to try military action into the former Soviet Union if Ukraine accepts loss of territory? Yeah, thanks, Babs. This is a really great question. One of the things now that Zelensky has passed on through his intelligence networks to the US is that there are Russian plans to extend into Poland as early as next year.
Yeah.
This, of course, is going to be this would be a huge provocation of NATO. They've already tested NATO boundaries. You know, the sort of NATO one-liner is not 1 inch. Well, they've flown missiles into Polish airspace. They've attacked other airspace, and we've not done anything about it. They don't want to start more of an international crisis. I think there's some due diligence in trying not to instigate World War III, although I will tell you just my own opinion that I think it started. It's happening, and you know, it's not just here. Look at what's going on in the Middle East, but also pay attention to what's happening in Taiwan. There's global things happening in motion right now that could set off a much, you know, historically speaking, we might look back on this moment in Ukraine as a starter of other things. But I think that Russia would not like to build back the Soviet Union, actually. They want to build back the Imperial Russian project, actually before the Soviet Union. The days of the Soviet Union are over. What Putin wants is to reclaim the sort of Russian imperial territory that his predecessors had. People like Peter and Catherine II, who you may know her as Catherine the Great, but my students sort of say she's been canceled. She's not Catherine the Great because of her colonization of Ukraine. We just call her Catherine II now. These are the people that he read during COVID. And before, he read a lot about problematic Russian history in which he saw Russia expanding territory as the sort of symbolic power of what a strong Russian leader does. And he's done this in very problematic ways. And so this is his legacy. So I think that he would like to occupy Ukraine. There's been motivations too about going after Moldova. There are things happening there that you should pay attention to. And also, if he tries to go after Poland as well, obviously this would be a European conflict, you know, full scale in that way. And I think he's using these moments to test how far these reactions will go. And so far, he hasn't met much resistance. So I very much and absolutely 100% believe that it won't stop at Ukraine should we let this go further. It'll be on a much larger scale, unfortunately. Thank you for that question. Oh, thank you, Heather, for sharing the resistance, the Ukrainian art.
Okay, try again. Can you hear, if we have questions in the in-person group, can you hear us okay?
Yeah, I can hear you, Jessica.
Are there any questions in the group? Mike?
The rest of Europe seems to be pushing back against the U.S. and Soviet peace talks. What is your thoughts on that?
Sorry, I just caught the end of it. Did you ask about what Europe is saying to all of this?
Yeah, so they seem to be pushing back on the Soviet U.S. only peace talks.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a sort of recent development in the sense that Europe has been playing second fiddle to the U.S. sort of geopolitical orientation of this whole war, because the U.S. has been such, a prominent supporter, both financially and militarily, of supplying Ukraine with defense weapons. And now, under the new Trump administration, that has completely upended things both domestically and internationally in just horrendous ways. We were warning about this as activists and scholars of Ukraine that if this were to happen, Europe would have to step up. Now, there are talks that they're in emergency meetings as of today. I've been teaching since 3 o'clock, so I haven't caught the news update as of this evening. But they seem to be understanding that they can't rely on the U.S. as a partner in this way anymore, and that they're going to have to build their own coalition of defense and support of Ukraine. Now, what I hope they realize that if they don't want to have to engage in this directly, they'll have to throw their support more fully and full stop behind Ukraine before it gets to them. That's why you're seeing these talks of European powers, and even as of this afternoon, New Zealand saying that they were willing to send in some troops to Ukraine or boots on the ground to sort of have a presence. Whether that will actually happen, I don't know. But Europe does seem to be awake to the issue. And they definitely seem to understand that they're going to have to do something now, that they cannot rely on the U.S. As equal partners anymore. Thank you for that question. I tried and get to these other two. What do you know about the EU's principles regarding Ukraine and their ability to foster solidarity for such? They seem to be less unified. Yeah, I mean, of course, like one of the main ambitions of Ukraine is to integrate into the West as part of the European Union and join NATO. Things that were provisionally on the table well before this full-scale war started, and even before it started in 2014. You'll remember back to the early 90s with the Budapest Memorandum, in which Ukraine gives up its nuclear arsenal. And a lot of people point to this as a misstep of this wouldn't be happening if Ukraine had access to these things. Right now, Zelensky has continued to advocate for Ukraine's integration into Europe more fully as a way to stop this, and it makes a lot of sense, right? They want to do this. The West benefits not only politically but also economically from Ukraine. They have an amazing IT sector, agricultural output. There's a lot to be gained from Ukraine being there. And now with their sort of expertise in the military, they'd be foolish to not have them as part of their system. But these sort of table declarations of joining NATO and the EU keep getting pulled back. And it doesn't seem likely that they're going to be extended to Ukraine anytime soon. So they do seem less unified, I agree. That might change if they have to come together to support Ukraine in different ways, but we'll see.
I have a question about this.
Oh, yeah.
What's going on with the refugees that left Ukraine? I think I heard 6 million of them are out of Ukraine. What's going to happen to them now, do you think?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a difficult one. So one thing that I've learned about working with refugees, which I hadn't done before, is you learn very quickly that being a refugee is much harder than just going back home to the war zone, actually. It's much harder to live outside of your country than to just go back. Many of the millions who left have gone back to Ukraine. Their families are there. Those with husbands and boyfriends and brothers and sons that cannot leave Ukraine due to military conscription policies. They want to see their families. Their kids go to school there. It's hard to integrate abroad. The funding that existed for Ukrainian refugees has dried up. Not every country wants Ukrainian refugees there. This is a problem in many places. Other events too have sort of pushed the world's attention away from Ukraine. The events of October 7th and Israel and Hamas, and other places too, other things going on across the world. And now domestically, there's a lot to focus on. These refugees are still around. They still need support, but a lot of people are sort of approaching this point in time in which their funds are drying up and they're going to have to go back to Ukraine. So many people have already gone back. They've returned to their homes and they're making do under war conditions as best as possible. Those who are maybe a little more financially privileged to, be able to live abroad or have connections, they've stayed abroad. A lot of, and the other reality too is a younger generation. Many of them get out and won't go back to Ukraine. They don't see a future there. They don't know what will be left after this war, and so they've tried to integrate into other places. So it's very mixed. I have a couple of friends who are sort of between Ukraine and other European countries, and they leave because the trauma of everyday sirens, just it's hard to be bombed every day. Your disruptions, your sleep cycles, your psyche is compromised. Many people find this impossible to live under. So those who can leave do. Most have gone back. And this is the reality. That major refugee crisis that we had in 2022 has sort of consolidated to a much smaller population. This question about Prigozhin, yeah, thanks, Pete. I guess it's hard to say. He, of course, leader of the Wagner Group, who had a huge presence in Central Africa. Actually, this is one of the most understudied, although not anymore, realities of Russia's sphere of influence is in certain African countries. There's been a large disinformation game that's been there. There's a wonderful, wonderful reporter there. His name is Philip Obadji, and he works in places like Congo and other very difficult to access places in which he goes in and studies Russian disinformation and Russian violence in African territories, and is alerting the world about it. In fact, he tested recently, just at the end of last year, in front of the Helsinki Commission in Washington, D.C., along with the prominent historian of Eastern Europe, Timothy Snyder. So there are people like Prigozhin who, were guilty of committing heinous war crimes both in Africa and in Ukraine with their famous sledgehammer. I won't go into details about that. You can sort of research that for yourself. It's very dark. Of course, he tried to make a sort of run on Moscow, but I don't think that he would have found much success. I don't think that it would have led to much in the way of significant change. It's got to be a much more robust, fully bought in by civil society, not just political society, for a change to have happened in Moscow and in the Kremlin.
Anyone else in the in-person group? It's online.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Instructor Vsetecka, for presenting today, and thank you all for joining us tonight for Town and Gown. Our next Town and Gown presentation will be on Tuesday, March 18th at 5 p.m. Green Inside, Elevating Indoor Environments for Healthier Living, Bringing Nature Indoors and Its Impact, presented by Jizone Lee, Assistant Professor of Interior Design at the School of Planning, Design, and Construction at MSU. Mark your calendars for our MSU Age Alive Research Forum on April 3rd, 2024. And please watch for additional details in the next few weeks. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having me. It's great to speak with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.